Washington, John R. Bolton has left the Situation Room, and President Trump is left at the table with a giant set of chips set on hotspots around the world. In Mr. Trump's view, the clock is ticking. He needs some big victories between now and the election in November 2020. But he also wants to prove that his idiosyncratic approach to foreign policy, as a series of deals rather than a philosophy of how American hardened soft power is deployed, can produce results that have eluded Washington's foreign policy establishment for a decade or more. Here's a look at 6 issues on the table. North Korea goal: total, complete and verifiable denuclearization, including an end to North Korea's intercontinental ballistic missile program. Ask Mr. Trump about his negotiations with Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, and he will tell you he is already winning. He was the first American president to meet a North Korean leader 3 times now, and the first to step briefly into North Korean territory. He has gotten back the remains of American soldiers and won a pause, which has lasted nearly 2 years, in nuclear weapons and intercontinental ballistic missile tests. It all led Mr. Trump to declare on Twitter, after his first meeting with Mr. Kim in Singapore, that North Korea was no longer a nuclear threat. The only problem is that the North's nuclear ability has increased since that meeting, by some estimates significantly. Intelligence estimates indicate that the North's stockpile of fuel has swelled, and so has its missile arsenal. Short-range missile tests have improved Mr. Kim's ability to strike American bases in South Korea and Japan with a new generation of weapons intended to avoid missile defenses. And the North hasn't turned over a list of its weapons, missiles and facilities, which was supposed to be the first step. Mr. Trump remains convinced that Mr. Kim will be impressed by the prospect of new hotels on the heavily mined beaches of North Korea's east coast. The whole country, he notes, is a great property, with easy access to China, Russia, South Korea and Japan. The only issue is whether he can persuade his new friend to give up the weapons that, in the North Korean leader's view, have kept him in office. That may mean settling with partial steps, starting with a nuclear freeze, on the way to a bigger deal that may or may not happen. Prospects for a win: next to none, unless Mr. Trump changes the goals. It is more likely he will agree to incremental reductions and call it a victory. Image: President Hassan Rouhani of Iran with Ali Akbar Salehi, the head of Iran's nuclear technology organization, in April. Credit agents: France Press, Getty Image. A searing goal: prevent Iran from getting within reach of a nuclear weapon. To the Trump administration, there is no more existential threat than Iran. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo sees it as the source of virtually all trouble in the Middle East, and Mr. Trump kept insisting to a series of aides that the only way to get a good deal with Iran was to destroy the 2015 nuclear agreement, which he dismissed as terrible, and a giveaway because it did not forever ban Iran from making nuclear fuel. Mr. Bolton, who before joining the administration was an advocate of American-led regime change in Iran, was an enthusiast of the maximum pressure campaign. And indeed it has been more successful than most experts expected. Iran's oil revenues have plunged, its economy is shrinking, and some of its elites are beginning to wonder whether it's time to acknowledge the inevitable, which is to negotiate with a president they can't stand. All eyes are on the opening of the United Nations General Assembly in 10 days. Mr. Trump and even Mr. Pompeo have said they're ready to negotiate without preconditions, and could meet with President Hassan Rouhani of Iran. I do believe they would like to make a deal, Mr. Trump said on Wednesday. If they do, that's great. If they don't, that's great, too. He insisted the goal remained the same. They never will have a nuclear weapon, he said. If they're thinking about enrichment, they can forget about it. The wild card here is Mr. Rouhani because he is unwilling to meet until sanctions are lifted, or so he says. Prospects for a win, not bad. The Iranians have a long history of changing their minds and negotiating when there are no other options. And unlike North Korea, they have no nuclear weapons, so they have less to give up. Afghanistan will preside over a peace deal in order to withdraw American troops. Every time Mr. Trump goes to Camp David, he sees pictures of Jimmy Carter, whose cabin-to-cabin diplomacy in 1978 brought peace between Israel and Egypt. Some aides think that inspired Mr. Trump to invite the Taliban, who gave haven to Al-Qaeda, to plan the Sept. 11, 2001 attacks to the presidential retreat. Mr. Bolton's argument that this was a crazy idea precipitated this week's rupture. But it's hardly over. The peace deal Mr. Trump is touting isn't the Camp David Accords. It would call for a reduction in violence and the beginning of a dialogue about power sharing between the Taliban and the American-backed Afghan government of President Ashraf Ghani. Few think it will lead to true peace, but it may be enough to give Mr. Trump the chance to significantly reduce the number of American troops in Afghanistan. Prospects for a win, fairly high. The only people who want American troops out more than Mr. Trump are the Taliban. Image President Xi Jinping of China at the Group of 20 summit this year in Osaka, Japan. Credit Aaron Schaff, The New York Times. Shanagawal, it's murky. The president constantly mixes his trade goals and his security concerns, often to the detriment of both. Mr. Trump miscalculated when it came to challenging President Xi Jinping of China. He thought Mr. Xi would fold as tariffs took the toll. So far, Mr. Xi has not folded, and market jitters are a reflection of the fear that the world's two largest economies could tank simultaneously. The bigger problem facing the Trump administration is that after nearly 32 months in office, it has no integrated China strategy. Mr. Pompeo and many in the military establishment view Mr. Xi, the most powerful Chinese leader in decades, as determined to spread the country's influence through Africa, Latin America and, increasingly, Europe, and to use its technology, led by Huawei-produced networks, to exercise control. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin and other members of the economics team are convinced that Mr. Xi, in the end, will take the best economic deal he can. And Mr. Trump, forever seeking flexibility, gyrates between these two posts, sometimes declaring China's progress on 5G networks, artificial intelligence and quantum computing a national security threat, and at other times suggesting that supplying those efforts is up for negotiation. Prospects for a win, poor. Xi is playing a long game, and Mr. Trump is playing for November 2020 Middle East goal, get the region to agree to the Kushner peace plan. The president and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, have taken 2 years to study Middle East peace, the deal of the century, Mr. Trump called it, and when they revealed the first part of the plan, it was all about getting wealthy Arab states, among others, to invest tens of billions of dollars in the Palestinian territories, as well as in Egypt, Jordan and Lebanon. But key decision-makers avoided the conference, and with Israel in the midst of its own campaign season, the political side of the plan won't be released until after the election, if then. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu preempted the whole proposal this week with his pre-election promise to annex nearly a third of the occupied West Bank, reducing any future Palestinian state to an enclave encircled by Israel. Prospects for a win, on life support. No evidence supports the idea that Mr. Kushner will succeed where others have failed. Image President Vladimir V Putin of Russia this month. Mr. Trump pushed for Russia to be allowed back into the Group of 7, despite the country's annexation of Crimea. Credit Mikhail Klemenchev, Agence France Presse, Getty Images. Russia goal, it's completely unclear. Surrounded by advisers who argue for containment, Mr. Trump overlooks offenses and argues for reintegrating Russia. Alone among his foreign policy advisers, Mr. Trump believes the key to dealing with Russia is reintegration, letting the country back into the group of seven, forgiving or ignoring its annexation of Crimea and never mentioning its effort to influence the 2016 election, a charge he has dismissed as a hoax. Meanwhile, the Pentagon is gearing up for a fundamental shift in policy in which Russia and China are regarded as revisionist states that must be challenged. And the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security and the National Security Agency say they're constantly creating plans to counter Russian malign influence in the 2020 election. Trump argues there is no reason for this, and says that with a little help to the Russian economy, President Vladimir V. Putin would be a lot easier to deal with. With Mr. Bolton gone, Mr. Trump may well try to negotiate an extension to the New START Treaty, the last remaining arms control agreement between the United States and Russia. But when it comes to lifting sanctions, Mr. Trump has run into a brick wall with his own party, whose leaders say they have no intention of reversing decades of hawkish views on containment. Prospects for a win. Mr. Trump is not playing poker here, he's playing solitaire. The only possible victory is an arms control treaty extension. Let's block ads. Why?